I wrote a book on contract for Bantam, and hopefully it'll be out next fall. And I'm hoping, I want to call it, and I'm hoping they'll go along with me, Why Eve Was Right, Plants, Drugs, and History. Because right there, in the beginning of the Western story in Genesis, what you get is it's the story of history's first drug bust. It's the story of a woman who follows her own mind and makes a decision about consciousness alteration, and then it works. When she says, and they were naked, and she perceived them as naked. In other words, she got true information about the situation. But you have Yahweh there mumbling to himself as he wanders around the garden in an old bathrobe, and he's saying, if they eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they will become as we are. That was always the issue, you see. It wasn't a health issue. It wasn't an abuse issue. It's about who finds out what's really going on and who doesn't. And this book I wrote for Bantam makes very clear that the style of a culture is almost always and invariably a style of seeing the world through a certain set of drugs or a drug. For example, here we're in the middle of a drug abuse problem, but caffeine has been entirely institutionalized since the Industrial Revolution. It's the only drug that has been honored in every labor contract that is signed anywhere. You have the coffee break. The coffee break is the workers' guarantees the workers' right to stimulate themselves, and in fact ultimately obligates the workers to stimulate themselves, because the machines and the tasks that they have been given totally reinforce the need for coffee, and the typing pool couldn't exist without coffee. Similarly, alcohol is tremendously spun in to patterns of male dominance. How many women have their first sexual imprinting in an atmosphere of male dominance and alcohol abuse? I mean, it almost goes hand in hand. And certainly up until the 20th century, there was about 800 years there when I don't think anybody got laid in Europe unless they were juiced. Because, first of all, people didn't bathe enough to make it an appetizing thing to contemplate unless, you were, pretty lit. So, and terrible distortions of Western politics and religiosity have taken place because of drugs. For example, and this is to me one of the most shocking examples imaginable, slavery died with the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome had a system of labor called the latifundia, which was essentially a slave work crew. And that institution died with the fall of Rome. During the medieval period, if you were into slavery, it meant you had one slave, and this slave was extremely well looked after and cared for because they were a symbol of munificent opulence on your part, that you could afford such a luxury. It was like having a Maserati to have a slave. Well, then around 1400, before the discovery of America, in the eastern Atlantic islands of Madeira, they began experimenting with the growing of cane sugar. And it was fine, except that the sugar has to be boiled at 130 degrees, and no one would work around that. They discovered that they had to chain people to the cooking apparatus for the extraction of sugar. And they began bringing Africans to do this. And they not only reinvented slavery for the deliberate production of sugar, which was utterly unnecessary to the diet of Europe. I mean, there hadn't been a ton of sugar imported into Europe in the previous 1,000 years. And suddenly they felt this tremendous need for sugar, and they reinstitutionalized slavery with the added insult that for the first time, a particular race was singled out as being somehow made for slavery. And this is the beginning of Black xenophobia on the part of Europeans, the association with the sugar trade. By 1800, every pound of sugar being imported into England was being produced by slave labor, and slavery was going at a rate that had not been seen since the Rome of Caligula, all in the name of commerce, all in the name of having this essentially trivial kick from sugar. So it's really important to educate ourselves as to what constitutes a drug and how drugs are legislated against and suppressed or promoted and advertised entirely according to whether they fit into the agenda of the reigning model of culture, whatever that may be.